The first sign of the coming storm wasn't the cold, but the silence. The birds had vanished 2 mornings before. The wind, once playful through the ridgeline trees, had gone still as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. And when that silence finally broke, it did so with a groan beneath the earth, a long, slow crack like timber splitting under invisible weight. Clara Adwell heard it first as she stepped outside her half-built cabin, knees sunk to the thigh in snow already crusted thick from 2 weeks of storms. She wasn't a large woman, and the chill wind tore right through the patched layers she wore, but her eyes didn't blink as she looked out across the ridge, down toward the crooked little town of Crow's Hollow, nestled in the valley below. Her 2 boys were asleep inside, buried deep under buffalo hides and hay-packed bedding in the place townsfolk had mocked, a buried cabin dug into the very side of the earth. She hadn't told them about the groaning noise, not her boys, not the townsfolk either, not after the way they'd laughed. Build in a grave before the snow even hits, she'd heard Bart Elkins scoff back in October when she'd traded for his dull spade. Ain't no shame in being scared of winter, Miss Adwell, but if you go to living like a mole, don't expect folks to bring pie come spring. But she hadn't built the cabin for pies or for gossip. She'd built it for one reason only, because she had seen what the last winter had done, and she'd sworn her sons wouldn't be next. Back then, Clara still lived up in old Widow Grafton's rotting loft above the general store. It was a loud winter, that one. You could hear families fighting over wood they didn't have. You could hear babies coughing through thin log walls. You could hear silence too, the kind that meant someone hadn't made it through the night. Her youngest, Eli, had turned blue from the cold before January was out. Clara had spent every hour laying across both her boys to keep their warmth in. That winter stripped her thin as a prayer, and come spring she didn't wait for permission or help. She loaded what little she had onto the back of her mule, took the children, and walked 4 miles up into the shallow ridge valley where the frost hung late and the wind whistled less. She found a spot with a south-facing rise and soft earth under the brush, and there she started to dig, not sideways into a hill like a root cellar, but downward like a man might dig for gold. Her neighbors called it foolish, but Clara had no neighbors now, only packed earth, quiet wind, and the sound of her boys breathing in sleep. The digging had taken her nearly all summer. She worked until her fingers blistered raw, then wrapped them in rags and kept going. She dragged stones from the creek to line the walls, laid timber across the top, then covered it all with dirt and grass like a wound stitched shut. By fall, it was hard to even see her cabin unless you stood on top of it. She left just a small chimney pipe poking out near the top and a ladder that led down through a narrow hatch. The ladder she pulled up each night before sleeping. What she'd built wasn't pretty, and it wasn't proud, but it was warm, or warmer at least. It held heat like a cave, and in a land where firewood was harder to find than water, that mattered more than pride. Now, standing atop that buried roof with her coat flapping against her legs, Clara heard the groan again. Louder this time, closer. The sky overhead was a dull white smear, flat and thick, not snowing yet, but heavy with it. She knelt, pressed her ear to the earth. A long moment passed. Then, there, the groaning sound again, not from the sky, not from the woods, from beneath, something shifting deep in the earth, slow and ominous like a glacier moving miles a year. Clara's breath caught, and she pressed a hand against the mound covering her cabin. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here, just buried under snow, ready to rise. She scrambled down the ladder and bolted the hatch shut behind her. The warmth hit her first, not hot, but bearable, enough to move your fingers without pain. The fire was out, long since banked, but the thick dirt walls had held what heat they could. Her boys, Eli and Thomas, stirred under the furs. She kissed their foreheads and pulled the buffalo hide tighter around them. Then she lit the lamp with shaking hands and took stock. 3 small loaves of dried bread, a pot of jerky stew barely touched, 2 buckets of snowmelt, mostly thawed, and in the corner, under the hay, the last of the dry wood, 4 logs and a bundle of kindling. It would have to stretch. She hadn't gone into town in over a week, not since the first signs of the deep freeze had crept in. They'd laughed at her then too. "Storm's long gone," someone had said. "You keep living like a mole, Clara. Your boys'll grow up afraid of the sun." But she'd seen the clouds. She'd seen how the animals behaved, how the sky looked just before sundown. The real storm was still coming. And now, it was here. Clara laid the kindling and struck flint, feeding the flames slow so the smoke wouldn't rise too fast. The buried cabin had a narrow stone chimney that ran slanted, designed to trap heat and let smoke creep upward in small bursts. Not much airflow, but enough. Enough to keep from choking. Enough to survive. The boys awoke an hour later. Eli's face was red from sleep, but his breath steamed less than it had the week before. That meant the warmth was holding. Thomas blinked up at her and whispered, "Is it still snowing?" "Not yet," Clara lied. But soon, she fed them half a loaf each and a bit of warm stew. They didn't ask for more. Her boys knew better than most that food wasn't always something you filled your belly with. It was something you stretched like hope. A little today so there could be a little tomorrow. The hatch trembled once. A soft bump from above. Clara froze. A single thump, then another. Something shifting. The snowpack. She rose and placed her ear against the door, but it wasn't the groan of ice or creaking timber. It was weight, pressing down, layers falling from the trees above, settling heavy atop her shelter. She stayed like that a long time, listening, counting the seconds between tremors, hoping, praying, then nothing. Silence again. Clara turned back to the boys. They were watching her, not with fear, but trust. And that hurt more than anything, because she didn't know how long this would hold. She didn't know if the air would last, or the food, or the logs. She didn't even know if the chimney would stay open once the snow fell deep enough. But she couldn't show that. She smiled instead, sat between them, pulled them close. They passed the day in quiet, reading from a torn Bible and scratching games in the dirt floor. Outside, the storm began in earnest, pounding against the earth like fists on a coffin. Snowdrifts collapsed trees, wind screamed through the ridgeline, and down beneath it all, in a space barely taller than a man, Clara and her boys waited out the world. Night came early. The lamp flickered low, and still the storm raged. Clara rose again, climbed the ladder just far enough to crack the hatch, but it wouldn't budge, not an inch, not even under her full weight. She stared at the trapdoor, at the rim, sealed tight with packed snow and ice from above. Not drifted, buried, crushed under weight no shovel could push. They were sealed in. The buried cabin had become what the townsfolk feared it would be, a grave, and if the chimney sealed too, Clara turned to look at the stone flue, now drawing a soft whisper of smoke, still open, for now, but outside, the snow was still falling, and inside, her boys were still watching her, and the woodpile had just dropped to 3 logs. She didn't sleep that night. Clara stayed by the fire, poking at it gently, rationing each stick of wood like it was a final breath. One of the last logs sat at her side, dry as bone, and she kept it untouched while the smallest coals flickered like dying stars. The buried room was dim, but not yet dark. It was warm, but not yet safe, and as the wind above howled with a sound like tearing sailcloth, she sat with her knees to her chest and listened for the death of their heir. Thomas slept curled beside Eli, the 2 boys nearly indistinguishable under the mass of hides. She'd layered their bedding with extra hay beneath it, knowing the ground could suck warmth away faster than open wind. Every night since the first snow, she'd told them bedtime stories about ships and faraway islands, about gold buried in sand, about rabbits who could outsmart foxes by living deep underground, and they'd laughed. They'd clung to her words as though they were warm cloth. Now she had no stories, just the scrape of fire, just the ache in her knees and the fear of waking up to blue lips and frozen silence. By the time dawn came, or what passed for dawn under a sky thick with storm, Clara had already used half the log. She woke the boys gently. They stirred slowly, like roots nudging up through frostbitten soil. "Breakfast?" Eli mumbled. His voice was thin, weak. Clara forced a smile. If the stew didn't run away in the night, maybe. They laughed a little, but it didn't reach their eyes. She ladled out 2 small cups of the thick, jerky broth, only a third each of what she might have given them last week. No bread this time. That had to be saved. The air inside was starting to feel different, not stale, but heavy, damp, the kind of air that made you breathe deeper without realizing why. And when she lit the lamp again, she saw the flame flicker oddly, not the way it did in a draft, but like it was struggling to breathe. She climbed to the hatch again, tested the weight, still sealed. She pressed her fingers along the edges, but it was packed so tight she couldn't even get the tip of her knife in the seam. She banged twice, just to see. No give, no sound. The world above was gone. She dropped down and went to the chimney instead. The narrow shaft ran upward at an angle through packed earth and stone, then curved slightly where it met the open air, designed that way to shed snow, to resist drafts, to hold heat, but it hadn't been tested under a burial. She held her hand near the chimney's mouth, still warm, still drawing air, but when she lowered a feather she kept for checking airflow, it barely moved. It was slowing. Her chest tightened, not from panic but from memory. A bird in a box, that's what they'd feel like soon. Like that dying bird she'd found trapped behind the attic eaves last spring, fluttering weakly in the dark. "Could we go up?" Thomas asked quietly. She turned to see him watching her, awake now, more awake than he should be. Children knew things. They always knew. They just didn't always ask. "No," she said gently. "It's not safe yet, but..." he started, then bit his lip. Sorry, she shook her head and held his hand. You don't ever need to be sorry for asking. The hours that followed were long and brittle. She kept the fire low, feeding it slivers and bark, coaxing heat from scraps. She taught the boys how to play silent counting, where you guess how long a minute lasts. They played stick draw in the dirt. They told each other what meal they'd have once the snow cleared. 3 eggs, hot biscuits, said Eli, eyes bright again for a moment. With sugar. And fish, added Thomas. Fried, with pickles. Pickles, Clara teased. Where would we even get pickles? I saw some, Thomas said, at Mr. Dorsey's store. Those were green tomatoes in vinegar, I think. He wrinkled his nose. Still good, she smiled, but she could feel it, just beneath her calm voice, the press of fear curling up her spine. The air was slowing. She could feel it. Not cold yet, but heavy. That evening she climbed the ladder again, this time with the iron cooking pan in hand. She wedged its edge beneath the hatch and tried to pry upward with her shoulder under it, but it didn't move. She tried again. Still nothing. Clara backed down the ladder slowly and sat beside the fire, head in her hands. For the first time in weeks, her fingers trembled, not from cold. She thought of the townspeople then, not with bitterness, but a strange emptiness. Bart Elkins, who said her hole in the ground would be her tomb. Mrs. Felter, who whispered that any woman raising boys alone would turn to madness before spring. All those faces lined up in judgment, so sure of their own stoves and brick chimneys, of their false sense of town warmth. They had homes, yes, but they were homes made for calm winters. This winter was not calm. It was the kind that broke roofs in half. And she wondered, were they even still alive? Had the wind torn off Elkin's shingles? Had the drift swallowed Mrs. Felter's porch? She didn't know. And now, buried beneath 8 feet of snow, she might never know. That night she didn't sleep again. Instead, she sat by the boys with her hand over their backs, feeling them breathe. Her lips moved silently in the dark, repeating the names of saints she barely believed in. St. Elmo, St. Barbara, St. Joseph. A prayer for patience, a prayer for air. And sometime in the middle of the night, the fire flickered hard, like a gasp. She sat up straight. The chimney. She rushed to it, held her hand near the stone. The heat was still there, but the drawer was weak. She tested it again with the feather. This time, it barely moved at all. It was clogging. She grabbed the old tin spoon and the rope. There wasn't a chimney brush. She'd meant to build one from pine and wool, but there'd never been time. So she tied the spoon to the end of the rope, bent it backward like a hook, and fed it into the flue, inch by inch, twisting, scraping. She worked for an hour, scraping, pulling, listening for a shift above, and at last, on the 3rd try, the feather danced again. Air, thin and cruel, but enough. She sagged to the floor, exhausted, face streaked with soot. Her hands bled in tiny lines from the rough stone. She hadn't realized she'd scraped the backs of her knuckles raw, but the boys were still breathing. The fire still cracked, and morning was only a few hours away. The next day passed in silence. They said little. There was no more stew, so she warmed snow and gave them sips of it with dried meat soaked soft in the cup. Eli was quieter now. He moved more slowly. His eyes were bright, but not with energy. Clara watched him carefully, heart pounding. She knew the signs. Hypothermia didn't always come as cold. Sometimes it came as sleep. She took him in her lap, held him close. She rocked him gently, whispering about warm fields and the sun. You remember the tree we used to sit under? She asked. Near the fence line at Miller's farm? Eli nodded faintly. You remember how warm it got, even in late October, and the grass smelled sweet, like dry corn husk? He nodded again, eyes still shut. It'll come back, she whispered. All of it. The sun, the smell of dirt. You just have to wait with me. The fire crackled once, then fell to embers. She rose and went to the last log, the final one. She didn't split it, not yet. She laid it carefully on the stones and closed her eyes. Outside, the snow was still falling. You couldn't hear it now. The wind had buried every sound, but something else had shifted. Pressure, maybe. A tightness in the walls. The buried cabin was holding. But for how long? She didn't know. And as she sat in the dim light of the coals, her boys drifting in and out of shallow sleep beside her, Clara did something she hadn't done since the storm began. She wept, quietly, so they wouldn't hear. Her shoulders shook with it, but her mouth made no sound. And then, just as she wiped her face and moved to tend the fire, she heard it. A knock, 3 short taps, distant, above. She froze. It came again, faint, muffled, but real. Someone was out there. The sound came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate raps from somewhere above the earth-packed ceiling. Not ice settling, not trees breaking. A knock. Clara stared upward, breath hitched halfway between prayer and disbelief. Her mind ran through every possibility in the span of one heartbeat. Snowdrift shifting, chimney collapse, a trick of her ears. But then it came again, clearer, Clara. Rap, pause, rap, a rhythm, intentional. She bolted upright and stumbled toward the ladder, nearly knocking over the lamp. The boys stirred at the sudden motion, Eli murmuring something incoherent, Thomas blinking into the half-dark. Clara waved a hand for silence as she climbed, heart hammering loud enough to echo through her spine. The hatch was still sealed tight. She pressed her palms against it and shouted, not loud but firm. "Hello?" No answer, but then, movement, just a shift, barely perceptible. Snow grinding above, not enough to open the hatch, but enough to change pressure. A trickle of dry white sifted in along the side seam, then a voice, distant, male. "You down there?" Muffled, as if shouting through a blanket, but unmistakable, human. Clara nearly wept from the sheer shock of it. She pressed her mouth to the hatch and shouted back, "We're alive! There's 3 of us! My boys! They're alive!" The snow muffled everything, but she caught the murmur of voices now, more than one. Another scrape, then something heavy landed above, maybe a shovel. Someone was trying to dig. Thomas had climbed to the base of the ladder now, staring up with wide eyes. "Is it help? I think so," she whispered, blinking back the tears. "I think someone's come." And just as quickly as the hope flared, her mind turned. Who? And how had they found them? The buried cabin was invisible from the ridge unless you knew exactly where to look. No trail, no chimney smoke, no signs of life. She had designed it to be hidden, to disappear into the land. So how had anyone found them? She turned back down the ladder, lips pressed tight. "What if it's bad men?" Thomas asked. "Like those ones from town that took Mr. Haddon's goats?" "It's not," she said, forcing calm. "It's not. No one would come all the way out here in this kind of storm unless they had a reason. But what if they came for us?" "Then they'd never knock," Clara said, with a sharpness that surprised even her. She went to the fire and added the last of the wood. There was no point in saving it now. If someone was digging from above, they'd need hours to clear that snow, and warmth would be the only thing standing between her sons and sleep they wouldn't wake from. The flame leapt, brighter than it had in days. Orange glow filled the tiny shelter and brought color back to the boys' cheeks. Clara moved quickly, pulling food from the hidden cache beneath the dirt floor. A small tin of lard, one last strip of smoked squirrel, a fistful of dried corn. She dropped it into the iron pot with snow and set it near the flame. The scent rose fast. Smoke, grease, memory. The boys sniffed the air like pups. Eli even smiled. Thomas looked at the ceiling again, eyes sharp. Above, the digging grew louder, faster. Shovels now, definitely. 2, maybe 3 people. The voices grew clearer. Male, one younger, one older. The older one cursed at the snow between gasps. Clara pressed her ear again to the hatch and caught snippets. "Told you, no one could live in this. Buried in 10 feet easy. Look, it's the pipe. Told you it was her." Clara backed down, dizzy from adrenaline. They knew, somehow, they'd seen the chimney, buried or not, and recognized it for what it was. She ran the scenarios through her head. Who in Crow's Hollow would bother coming all this way, in weather this bad, just to check on a woman the whole town called mad? And then it struck her. Aaron Dealey. The boy had followed her once during summer, when she was hauling stones. She'd caught him watching from the trees, didn't say a word then, just looked at her with eyes that didn't mock like the others. His mother had died 2 winters before. Maybe he understood. She remembered now. He'd asked her once, soft and quiet, "Does it work, Miss Adwell? A cabin under the ground?" And she'd nodded, not smiling. "Only if you build it like a grave." He hadn't laughed. Now it seemed he hadn't forgotten. More voices. Then the sharp chop of a hatchet against frozen timber. Clara pulled the boys into her lap and wrapped them both in the thickest fur. Heat radiated outward from the flame, filling the shelter with a fragile glow. She could feel their bodies vibrating with warmth again. Her own hands had stopped shaking. Minutes passed, then hours. The sound of digging became sharper, then dull again. Then finally, light broke through a crack in the hatch. A sliver at first, just a razor's edge, but it bled down like sunrise. Clara shielded her eyes and climbed the ladder fast. She pushed up with her shoulder, and this time it gave. The hatch heaved upward 6 inches, snow cascading inward. She shoved harder, and the lid flung open with a crunch of ice. And there, faces red from the cold, stood Aaron and his father. They looked down at her like they'd seen a ghost. "We thought you were gone," the elder Dealey muttered. "Everyone said, well, no one thought you'd made it." Clara blinked into the white glare. Snow still fell, but lightly now. The storm was breaking. Trees all around were draped in heavy frost. It was midday, but the sun was only a pale smear in the clouds. "How long?" she croaked. "How long since it started?" 8 days, said Aaron. She felt the number hit like a slap. 8 days sealed underground. She'd lost count. She'd thought it was 4, maybe 5. "I saw the pipe," Aaron added. "Thought it looked wrong, like it shouldn't be there. Told Pa. We figured Maybe you were in trouble. Clara almost laughed, not from joy, but disbelief. You walked here in this? We lost our roof, the older Dealey said, not meeting her eyes. Came up the ridge to find better wood. Never thought we'd find anyone alive. Clara stepped up through the hatch and looked around. The world was buried. The entire ridge lay under a crust of snow and ice, glittering like broken glass. Trees bowed under white weight. No tracks, no animals, just silence, stretched thin and brittle. She turned and called down, voice trembling. Boys, come on. But slow. Thomas came first, pushing up through the hatch with wild eyes. Then Eli, slower, blinking against the brightness. Aaron stepped back as the children emerged, stunned. He looked from them to the buried shelter, and then at Clara again. You were right, he whispered. It worked. She said nothing, just pulled her boys close. The elder Dealey exhaled and nodded at the trees. Come with us. We're camped by the outcrop not far. Got a fire, some dry stuff, maybe a mule. Clara hesitated, looked back at the cabin. It had saved them, but it had nearly buried them alive too. She nodded slowly. Let me get something first. She climbed down once more and gathered the last bits of food, the pot, the lamp, the tin. Then she stopped and stared at the hearth. Just stone and soot now. The fire was out, ashes cold. She reached into her coat and pulled free the last stub of candle. With shaking hands she lit it, left it on the hearth, and climbed out of the grave she had built. By the time they reached the outcrop, the sky had begun to clear. Not much, just a crack of light through the clouds, but enough. Aaron's father was quiet the whole way, leading the mule with frozen hands. When they stopped at a makeshift camp beneath the rocky shelf, he turned to Clara, nodding once. Storm's breaking, he said. Clara looked out across the valley, where the tops of Crow's Hollow's buildings barely peeked through the frost. The town had mocked her, called her mad, but the storm had come, and she had lived. So had her sons, because when no one else had believed, she had dug and buried herself in a place where only the determined could rise again. They stayed the night beneath the outcrop. Aaron and his father had hacked out a pit in the lee of a rock face, lined it with spruce branches and blankets stiff with frost. The fire burned low but steady, casting long shadows across the snow-glazed trees. Clara sat beside it with her arms around Eli and Thomas, their small bodies pressed into her sides, both boys asleep before the first ember cracked. It wasn't warm, not like the buried cabin, but it was air, it was open sky, it was the cold on her cheeks and the wind across her face, and that made it feel like freedom. She barely spoke that night, neither did Aaron. The boy sat with his chin on his knees, eyes fixed on the flame as if hypnotized. His father tended the fire, fed it slow and steady, whittling bark into curls with the tip of his knife. Around them, the blizzard's remnants hissed through the branches, but it no longer howled. The world was thawing, inch by inch, and yet something in Clara did not thaw. Not yet, because now that the storm had passed, now that her sons were breathing freely again, unburied, there was something else creeping in, a new kind of fear, the kind that comes after survival, when everything slows and the quiet lets you think again, when you realize you don't have a plan for tomorrow. She stared into the coals and whispered without lifting her head, "What's left in town?" Aaron's father didn't answer right away. Then he shifted, spat into the snow. "Not much," he said. She turned to him. "Last we saw," he continued, "Elkin's roof was caved in. Rosedale lost half their wall. Heard someone yelling from inside the boarding house on Main, but couldn't get to 'em. Snow'd drifted too high." Clara said nothing. "There's still folk alive," he added. "Probably more than we know, but they're not moving yet, not till the thaw sets in." "When?" "Week, maybe 2. She nodded slowly. She remembered the winter of 72, when the river froze solid, and 2 men died trying to cross it on foot. This had felt worse, deeper, hungrier. She thought again of her cabin, how close they'd come. If Aaron hadn't seen the chimney, if he'd hesitated a day longer. Her arms tightened around her boys. "I have to go back," she said suddenly. Aaron's father looked at her, startled. "To what? That grave you dug? It's not just a hole. I built it right. There's tools, supplies, things we need." He frowned. "Ma'am, with respect, I have to go back," she said again, firmer now. He studied her face, then gave a tight nod. "Tomorrow then, when the sun's up." The night passed slow, but it passed. At first light, Clara rose. The snow had hardened into a crust, thick and glassy, but walkable if you knew where to step. She left the boys curled beside Aaron, who gave a quiet nod, as if he understood without asking. Her legs were stiff, muscles trembling with fatigue. But she moved with the resolve of someone who'd carried fear for too long. The buried cabin had changed. From above, it looked like a rise in the snow, just another drift among many. But she saw the chimney pipe, crooked now, bent slightly from the pressure of the digging. The hatch was still ajar, crusted in frost. She dropped to her knees beside it and peered in. Silence. No more fire. The room below was dark, but not collapsed. She climbed down slowly, one rung at a time. Inside, the air was sharp with soot and old smoke. The coals had long since died. The stone walls were damp, slick in places where the frost had seeped in. Her breath misted white in the stale air, but it didn't freeze outright. Not yet. She moved quickly, collecting what she could. The tin cup, the spoon, the bits of dry kindling that hadn't burned, a sack of old clothes she'd hidden behind the stones, a jar of vinegar-soaked roots she'd forgotten. All of it mattered now, but as she turned to go, she paused. Something was wrong. Not collapsed, but shifted. The northern wall, where she'd braced it with creek stone, had bowed inward slightly, only by an inch, maybe less, but it was enough. The freeze had swelled the earth around the shelter. Her careful stacking had held, but barely. Another week, maybe two, and the room would have crumbled inward under its own weight. They would have died in silence. She stood there a long moment, staring at the wall, then at the hearth. The candle she'd left behind was still there, still burned to the base. Her knees weakened. She sat down, shaking. She hadn't realized how near the end they'd come. She closed her eyes, let the silence swallow her, and then, from above, footsteps. She climbed out into sunlight. Aaron stood nearby with Thomas in his arms, and Eli beside him, wrapped in the oversized blanket Clara had stitched from flour sacks. "We came to help," Aaron said simply. She didn't answer, just held out the bundle of salvage supplies. The boy took it. They walked back in silence. That afternoon, Clara took stock. She laid out every item beside the fire under the outcrop: the jar of pickled roots, the last tin of powder for baking, a dull knife, flint, the spoon, the dented cup, a set of wool socks so mended they looked more thread than fabric, a scrap of dried apple skin. "Is that all?" Aaron's father asked. She nodded. "It'll do," he muttered. But they both knew it wouldn't, not for long. The boys were eating well again, only because the Deeleys had dried venison, but that would run out, and the rest of Crow's Hollow, no one had much to spare. The town had lived easy off last year's mild winter. They'd stocked less, prepared less. They had laughed at her for digging. Now they'd pay for it. That evening, Clara stood at the ridge's edge and looked down into the valley. The sun had broken through finally, casting pale fire over the rooftops half buried in snow. No smoke rose, no movement stirred. The town was still sleeping, but not dead. Not yet. She knew what had to be done. "We'll go tomorrow," she said. Aaron's father looked up. "To town?" She nodded. "We'll bring what we can, check on who's left, start clearing roofs, digging doors." He didn't answer, just stared at her. "You've got sons, don't you?" she asked. He flinched. "One," he said. "James, died last spring." She bowed her head. "I'm sorry," he waved it off. "Fever, nothing to do with snow." "But everything does eventually," Clara said. "Cold gets into everything if you let it." He looked at her long and hard. "You really think you can pull Crow's Hollow back from this?" "I think I have to try," she said, and she did. The next day, she led the first digging party into town. Just 3 people, Clara, Aaron, and his father. They carried makeshift shovels, rope, and torches. The sun had softened the top crust of snow, just enough to allow motion, but not enough to make it safe. One wrong step, and the crust might give way to a 10-foot sinkhole beneath. They reached the first house, Bart Elkins's, and found the roof entirely collapsed. But the cellar entrance had been braced. Inside, they found Bart alive, his leg broken, half mad with fever. He cried when he saw them. They dragged him out with a rope harness, built a fire on the spot, fed him a spoon of pickled roots, then moved to the next house. That night, 4 more came back with them, half frozen, dazed. One childless woman, whose husband had died on day 2 of the storm. She didn't speak, just followed Clara back to the outcrop like a ghost. By the end of that week, 15 survivors had gathered around the ridge. Clara's buried cabin became a symbol, though it remained untouched. She didn't need it anymore. It had done what it was built for. Now she built other things: snow pits, vent chimneys, sloped windbreaks from bundled branches. They dug paths between shelters, shared fire, divided food. Crow's Hollow hadn't died because one woman, mocked and alone, had prepared for the storm no one else believed in. And now she wasn't alone anymore. Not really, because the storm had changed everything. And when the thaw came, so would the reckoning. The thaw came not with warmth, but with rot. The snow didn't melt so much as it sagged, slow, sour, slushing downward as if the mountain itself had decided to sink. What had once been clean drifts and powder became banks of grey mush, layered with tree needles, dead birds, cracked bark, and from beneath the snow came smells, mildew, meat, oil, smoke, and worse. It was March by the time Clara stood again on the slope above Crow's Hollow, her boys beside her, staring down at the town that had once mocked her. The whole valley still reeked of stillness. No wagons moved, no church bell rang, just wind now, soft and thin, finally warm enough to raise the scent of old smoke and death. But there were survivors, more than they thought. By the 10th day of the thaw, over 40 people had come out of the snow, most of them half-starved, many broken in body, all silent. They emerged from root cellars, from collapsed lean-tos, from mud holes that barely held air. Some had burned furniture for heat, some had eaten seed stock, a few had eaten worse. Clara didn't judge. She simply worked. She had become something else now. Not just a mother, not just the woman who'd dug a cabin into the side of a hill, but a signal. The town had begun to call her by another name, whispered at first, then said with something like awe, "Grave woman." It wasn't meant as an insult anymore. It was a name born of quiet respect. The woman who had buried herself before the snow came and walked out with both sons alive. She never used the name herself. She just did what she knew how to do: ration, build, and hold fast. The first structure she built after the thaw was a wind shelter in front of the broken storehouse, made of logs lashed together with harness leather. Then came the trench, cut through the snow by hand, connecting the general store to the livery barn. Then the warmth cellars, dug deeper this time, with rocks heated by fire and vented smoke. It became clear quickly. No one else in Crow's Hollow had thought beyond their walls. They'd believed in chimneys and windows and iron stoves. Clara had believed in the ground, its weight, its silence, its ability to keep what was inside, and now they followed her. By mid-March, she was leading fire patrols at night, carrying torches to check on flues, digging out drifted indoors, watching for cave-ins. Not a single person challenged her authority. Even the men who had laughed at her most, Elkins, wounded and bedridden, and two of the ranchers who had once jeered her in the store, kept their mouths shut when she entered a room. There were no speeches, no apologies, just silence and work. That was how she preferred it. One morning, near the end of March, Clara returned to her buried cabin. The snow around it had pulled back, revealing the earth-packed mound and the crooked chimney pipe. The hatch was stuck halfway open, swollen by frost, leaning to one side. She stood before it a long time, her boys quiet behind her. "Can we go back in?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "No." "Why not?" Clara crouched beside the entrance and ran her hand along the warped edge of the hatch. "Because it held when it needed to, but now it's tired." She opened the door fully. Inside, the floor had sagged in places. One corner wall had cracked. The stones had shifted. The air smelled old, like spent breath. It would have collapsed if they'd stayed another week. Thomas leaned in and whispered, "Is it dead?" Clara smiled faintly. "Cabins don't die, baby, but they rest. This one did its job. It's earned its sleep." They didn't go inside again. She packed the hatch with stone and laid a crossbeam across it. By April, the roads were thick with mud. 2 wagons arrived from the north, bringing news from the mining town of Thistle Glen. Word of the storm had spread. People wanted to know who had survived, who hadn't. They asked about Crow's Hollow, and the Dealys, father and son, told them the truth. They told them about Clara Adwell, the woman who had buried herself and her children and lived, who built a hole in the ground when others laughed, who lit a fire when the world froze over. The wagons left again a day later, but the story spread faster than wheels could roll. More people came, looking for shelter, looking for wisdom, looking for the woman who had outlasted the storm. She didn't speak to them at first. She just showed them how to bank a fire so it burned longer, how to trap heat in walls made of dirt and sod, how to feed 5 on what used to feed 2, how to listen to the wind and know when it stopped being a friend. One day, the widow Marla Kent, whose son had died early in the storm, asked Clara how she'd known to dig that deep, to cover her roof with 5 feet of earth, to make the flue slope instead of rise. Clara didn't answer at first. Then she said, "Because I couldn't afford to be wrong." Marla nodded once. That was enough. In May, when the grass returned to the valley, Clara helped raise the first new building, half buried, half raised, a cross between a cabin and a cave. They used earth from the thaw and beams pulled from barns that had collapsed. It was small, humble, but it stayed warm through the cold rain that followed. By June, 3 more were built like it, then 10. By August, Clara no longer needed to lead the digging. Others had taken up the work. Aaron had grown taller. Eli and Thomas had begun helping with the trench stoves, new designs that held heat for hours using only a few sticks. They called them grave hearths. She never corrected the name. She did what needed doing. By the fall of that year, Crow's Hollow had changed. It no longer looked like the place she'd first come to, carrying her boys in one hand and a shovel in the other. The houses were lower now, built closer to the earth. The chimneys leaned at angles. The snowbanks were managed with wind walls and mud channels. Children were taught how to find breathable pockets under snow. Old men stopped bragging about hearth size and started asking about wall thickness. And Clara, she became part of the land, not a leader by title, just the woman who had already walked through the worst. They still called her Grave Woman. They carved it into the wooden beam outside the meeting hall she helped build. She never asked for the honor. She just kept doing what she'd always done, keeping her boys warm, teaching what she knew, and preparing for the next storm, because it would come again. They always did. And next time, no one would laugh when someone built a home beneath the earth. They would nod, they would listen, and they would remember the woman who dug not out of madness, but out of love, out of a refusal to let the cold take what little warmth she had left, out of the knowledge that the earth didn't bury you when you were ready for it. It saved you.